Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to cover Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's visit to Washington in the state of transatlantic relations as we approach the 100-day mark of the second Trump presidency. Then we turn to a conversation with Janka Oertel, director of the Asia program and senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, to discuss EU-China relations and how each side is grappling with Trump's disruptive style of diplomacy. Donatien, we are here speaking on Monday, April 21st. I'm just back from spring break. I think a lot of Europe is on spring breaks. How was your spring break going?
Well, I didn't get any because I don't have children who are in school and I'm not in Europe, but it was good. Things were a little bit quiet.
It does feel, I would have to say, that transatlantic relations are in a bit of a spring break, that we are waiting for the new German government that has now been agreed upon to then come to office. And so what does Friedrich Merz do on a lot of all these defense policy questions? How does he approach Paris? How does he approach Poland? What is his policy towards the United States? Then on the tariff fight, I guess it's still happening. You know, China is really in the barrel, so the Europeans look like they've gotten a little bit of a reprieve. On the tech fights that are coming, I guess the Commission has made its determinations on especially the Digital Markets Act, but also waiting for what the Commission's going to do on the Digital Services Act, and just sort of waiting for what's going to happen there. And that's been tied in now with a lot of the trade and tariff discussions that are happening. And at the Pentagon, we're sort of waiting to see what the cuts are coming from the United States when it comes to European force posture in Europe. Oh, and then also the Russia-Ukraine, we're just sort of waiting for these negotiations or talks to sort of spin out. So everyone's just sort of feels like we're on spring break, twiddling our thumbs, waiting for some direction in course of action or confrontation in transatlantic relations.
And we should say on the European side as well, we were recording on the day where the announcement came that the Pope died. So honestly, at least in Italy and then in the rest of Europe, it's going to be top of the news for the next few days about the funeral. And then it's going to shift to the conclave and the selection of the next Pope. So that also, it's a lot less cheerful than a spring break. Also comes right on the back of Easter. This is all going to take over, I think, a lot of headlines on the European side at the very least.
It feels a little bit like, we had a storm of activity in transatlantic relations, especially in February and March. Now feels like a little bit of reprieve, but is this the eye of the hurricane and we're about to get walloped by all sorts of conflicts and clashes over all sorts of issues? Or, or do we find ourselves in a more sort of stable place? I think it's yet to be determined. I would sort of bet on the former rather than the latter, i.e. I bet more conflict is coming.
I think so too, but to put it in terms that the president would enjoy, it also kind of feels like a boxing match where first round came, everybody kind of threw punches about the tariffs, about the tech stuff, about Ukraine, and everything that came in the last almost 100 days. And now everyone is back in their corners trying to figure out what that meant now that things have settled for a second, now that we have this visit from Meloni. And I think each side is trying to figure out what they can do towards the other and what they can ask of the other. Obviously, very different approaches in how they're creating that list of possibles. But that's how it feels like in my mind. Is like first round is over. Let's see when second round starts.
So let's talk about the Meloni visit. She came to Washington, D.C., essentially seemingly on behalf of not just Italy, but the European Union as being, one of the biggest countries in Europe and a senior, obviously a very powerful prime minister. And not a lot of European officials have gotten meetings. There's been no call between Trump and Ursula von der Leyen yet. How do you assess the visit? I was on spring break. So what happened? What went on?
Well, on the whole, it's positive. At the very least, no shouting matches in the Oval, which seems to be the standard now. Even more than that, I was very positive. The two of them clearly have a good, warm relationship. Trump seems to respect her. She seems to respect him. She had in the past talked pretty positively about him and his administration, and that showed. It was also clear that she came, as you were mentioning, kind of with a mandate to speak not fully on behalf of the European Union, but to keep the EU's interests in mind while she was talking to President Trump. because they talked about their areas of alignment. But when it came to issues around the European Union on trade tariffs, she also reaffirmed that she cannot speak on behalf of the EU and that trade decisions are made at that level, but that she hopes that we can come to a deal. So that balance, which was potentially pretty difficult going into it, it seems she achieved that. We saw as well their alignment on more ideological things. That came out as well, because I think it's easy to forget that Meloni still hails from a far-right party with very specific domestic policies related to immigration, to social issues. They talked about, opposition to DEI programs and how that's going to cost us our civilization. She talked about making the West great again. So that's really where we're reminded, yes, she is still hailing from a very particular side of the political spectrum in Italy and in Europe. And that's also what creates, I think, some of the good relationship that she has, not just with Trump, but also with the vice president, for example. And on that one, they also align on issues of faith. So she was the right messenger for it. The symbolic frame was positive and accomplished. It's just not really clear what the outputs are immediately.
The center left in Italy, I don't think has forgotten that she's from a far right party. But I have to say, Meloni, since being in office, has been on relatively good terms with Brussels, and particularly with von der Leyen. And the appointment of von der Leyen for a second term, was a little rocky here and there. And Meloni played it such that it effectively enabled von der Leyen to regain a second term. I don't know how close a relationship, but it clearly is not a combustible relationship. I think Meloni sees it in her interests that von der Leyen be empowered at the EU level, and that Italy really needs the European Union, both in terms of funding and market access and potentially, being on good terms. If anything went south in the Italian economy, having the European Central Bank there is quite useful and has really sort of helped prevent sort of growing spreads between German debt and Italian debt. I think there's a sort of relationship there where it strikes me that Meloni is quite a good conduit to the Trump administration, in particular because of those interests, in a way that someone like Orban, who's not trusted by the rest of the EU, Meloni, there's, I think, a degree of trust in Brussels that she's at least on the European team. Well, with Orban, there's a sense that maybe he's not with us. And I have to say, one of us, that was me, that was quite clairvoyant about this back 14 months ago, but wrote about how, quote, that European leaders, perhaps Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, may be willing to serve as an interlocutor on behalf of the European Union in engaging with the Trump administration. We wrote that about how European transatlanticists should really approach the Trump administration, finding people that can engage with this administration, and her being able to sort of speak the far-right ideological language. While many in Europe may find that repugnant, I think does serve potentially as a bridge builder. And I think at this point, you kind of want to build as many bridges as possible because there's going to be a lot of forces going and colliding against all the other bridges that are being built or have been built over time.
No, it doesn't hurt at all. And obviously, crystal ball sticker for you, Max, for predicting all of this last year. It is important to have multiple interlocutors who can do this. Meloni is one of them. President Macron is another one. Also to have the ability to gently push back or reinsert the opinion that Europeans have around the Ukraine war, for example. At the press conference, she made clear that Putin and Russia were the aggressor. So to have that voice next to President Trump whenever these conversations come up is also really important in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. And, there was sort of the positive signal that Trump gave over a trade deal with the EU and noting that, quote, we're in no rush to sort of cement something before the 90-day pause on tariffs runs out in July. Some positive good news. But again, is this sort of the eye of the hurricane, or are we sort of seeing some off-ramps in the conflict that emerged over the next few months? I mean, if I were, I think in many European capitals, I would be hoping that this works out, but then really planning for it not to be. And that's where then getting to Merz becoming chancellor, what happens on European defense proposals, also a lot of the efforts on the Draghi report implementation to sort of get Europe's own economic house in order to really ramp up European economic growth. All of that, I think, it doesn't alleviate any of the urgency, I think, behind those efforts. There's always a fear that if anything starts to go well in transatlantic relations and things seem sort of docile, that sort of reduces the momentum for any sort of reforms or changes that aren't needed.
Well, you would hope that Europeans have now realized it can't be like that anymore. because it's just a fundamentally different trajectory they need to be on at this moment. Whatever happens on the road to the next NATO summit will most likely impact the conversations that are happening on trade, because this administration has shown that it's very willing and very open to mixing all of these issues together. So we definitely have a lot more of potential hurricane in front. But for a country like Italy, it's a very difficult balance because, as you were saying, they're so incredibly reliant on the trade that they have in the European Union, on the ability of the central bank to stabilize their financial situation. But at the same time, they have a very important trading relationship with the United States. If you take out from the total the trade that Italy has intra-European Union, the U.S. is responsible for 22% of Italy's exports. That's huge. So it's a hard balance to strike. So far, she's done a pretty good job of that. And we see this, as I was saying, in her relationship with Donald Trump, but also with J.D. Vance, who was in Italy the day after they met. They flew back basically together. Vance was going for Easter Mass. He met with the Pope and obviously met with Meloni as well in Rome to talk more about the U.S.-Italy relationship. So she's really creating these ties that hopefully other European leaders can rely on as well.
That's great. But then let's see what happens when...
Oh, no promises for sure.
Friedrich Merz, and when he's chancellor, and I think the upcoming NATO summit, again, we're just sort of waiting for big announcements that come here in Washington, and that will sort of point the course. And I think one of the key questions, and this is a good segue to our conversation with Janka, is how does Europe then approach China? Do they see this as a need to kind of hedge between a weakening transatlantic relationship and time to sort of turn to China and try to mend ties? Or do they kind of continue on the path that Europeans have been on, which is a quite confrontational one, maybe a little bit less so than the United States, but viewing China really as a strategic competitor? And that's, I think, going to be a really interesting question for Europeans to face. And we'll discuss that with Janka in the interview coming up.
We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Janka Oertel to the Eurofile. Janka is a director of the Asia program and a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She has published widely on topics related to EU-China relations, US-China relations, security in the Asia-Pacific region, Chinese foreign policy, 5G, and emerging technologies, as well as climate cooperation. Janka, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So we are talking to you at a very opportune time for US-Europe relations with China. Let's start by setting the stage. How important is the economic relationship between Beijing and the European Union? And perhaps if you could tie into that also the importance of the diplomatic relationship in the last few years.
So, of course, China for Europe is a very important economic partner, but this is not for Europe. It's actually for Germany. And that is the kind of specificity of the relationship that is really important in understanding this, because for most other European countries, exports to China are a fraction of their overall economic dependence. It is an import dependence and in certain specific sectors, but it's by far not their most important partner. Most trade takes place within the EU for most of the European players. This is the sort of the largest component. And even for Germany, the US had overtaken China as the most important bilateral trading partner in the last 2 years. So the relationship with Beijing is one of the key economic relationships of Europe. It is a very important economic relationship for Germany, but it is certainly not outweighing the United States relationship. But this is why this is so problematic, because for the Europeans, it seems like both of our most important economic partners are slightly going off the rails at the moment. And that brings us in a very difficult situation.
When you say slightly going off the rails, I'm curious what that means to you for China in particular. Do you mean because they're embroiled in this escalating trade war with the United States, or there's something specific happening in China that is also a problem for the European Union?
China is still China. And the economic relationship between China and Europe does not necessarily change just because of the Trump administration. It has changed over the last few years because China's economic policy has been detrimental to European interests. It has been market shares that have been shrinking for European companies in the Chinese market because of a strong determination of the Chinese leadership to nationalize and to sort of have a more security-focused and more domestic-focused industry, to champion their local champions in comparison to competition with international players. So while exports to China are going down, the role in the Chinese market is going down. Chinese players have also become formidable competitors on third markets and even in the European markets for European players. So European industry is massively under pressure from the kind and the way that the Chinese economic policy is structured, and that China's industrial players are emerging on the global market and in the European market. And so this is a real problem in and of itself. And of course, on top of that comes China's massive support to Russia at the moment, at a time where Russia is fighting a war against basically European interest in Ukraine. So this is something that has not gone unnoticed and has, over the last few years, since the full-scale invasion in 2022, has really changed the way that Europeans are thinking about China as well. And now we're in this weird limbo situation where, while all of that remains true, all of a sudden the US problem comes on top of it. And that changes the relative balance. And in some capitals in Europe, this may seem like China all of a sudden looks like an option again. And so now we're in this turmoil where all of the different positions that were seen as super static are a little bit more in flux. That's true for the member states. That's not necessarily true for Brussels, where we see a lot of continuity when it comes to the China policy at the moment.
Yeah, maybe I could pick up on that and take a step back. I think that a lot of the foreign policy hands that maybe don't focus on China, but are right now consumed with the tension in transatlantic relations, that probably those tensions are not going to subside anytime soon, look at this and say, okay, now it's a time for Europe to hedge. There's no reason why Europe has to follow the United States in having a very confrontational policy with China. We did that during the Biden administration, in part because that was a way of cementing transatlantic relations. But now we can go to Beijing and we can talk to the Chinese and maybe establish a better relationship. What do you think about that broader narrative? My general take is I think it's rather simplistic, yet I think there may be some points where there could be engagement with China. You mentioned China's support for Russia. Europe, to me, hasn't really prioritized that, I think, in their engagement. But there could be other things that China maybe makes some concessions to Europe, and there's some sort of engagement, some sort of quote unquote deal. I don't think it's, any sort of grand partnership, but maybe there's some elements there where you could see Europe and China becoming a bit more aligned, a bit closer on certain areas. What do you think of that broader narrative?
That broader analysis, in theory, sounds great to Europeans, right? Because it gives you options at a time of very shitty options that you are on the table. When you only have bad choices, it does seem like, there's another one out there that is the opportunity that is emerging in all of the chaos. In theory, that's great. In practice, it doesn't change anything about the situation that we're facing. On the economic side, China's challenge remains just as big and actually has just gotten bigger because Chinese companies are even under greater pressure for exports, because the potential for China to now seek new markets that it can't export to the United States, where Europe becomes the absorption capacity, the big sponge that could absorb even more cheap Chinese exports and thereby create even more problems for the domestic economy. But all of these problems are just exacerbated through that. And I don't think it is correct to say that Europe has not prioritized China's relationship with regard to Russia over the last few years, particularly in the last 2 years. The messaging that has come from European member states when going to Beijing has been super, super clear. There were two talking points, basically. One was the big overcapacities issue, so Chinese dumping into European markets and the destruction of European industry. And the second was China's relationship with Russia. And that was a very, very coordinated message. And it was very clear that this would be something that the Europeans would take very seriously. Now, a caveat to that, they didn't go as far as to say, we'll sanction Chinese companies because of their relationship with Russia. But this was all part of sort of the balancing act that we're seeing in an economy in Europe that is very much under pressure right now, and sort of is trying to navigate the space of changing geopolitical realities that have huge economic impact for Europeans. But I think it's not fair to say that the Europeans have not mentioned to the Chinese that they do have a problem with the Russia relationship. They have. But obviously, this is the situation now where everything has to be reassessed. So this is why I think it is important to sort this a little bit. Whereas for individual member states, and we can take maybe Spain as an example, with Sanchez traveling to China again last week, and where we sort of have all of the messaging going on, there are countries, member states of the EU, that are interested in attracting Chinese investment, that are interested in car factory investments, battery investments, wind turbine factory investments in their own country for, as I would say, short-term political gains, short-term political incentives. The long-term economic incentive isn't even entirely clear of this, but the short-term political incentive is obviously clear about this. And then there is the dimension of the Brussels narrative right now. And the Brussels setup is very, very clear and actually quite sober in the analysis of saying we need to pursue a path towards China out of our very own interests. And actually, it is an area in which we see as sort of the other way around from the question. We see a room for collaboration with the United States on this, despite everything that's going on. So in the first statement that Ursula von der Leyen made after the tariffs were announced on the US side, she caveated everything and said, well, actually, we see potential to work with the United States with all those others, that's kind of code for China, that are actually undermining the international trade order. And we would be happy to collaborate on these issues. And you see that again with the conversations that Shevkovich was having just now in Washington, where the question of overcapacities is addressed, where the question of steel and aluminum is addressed. These are all those issues that are actually China-related issues, where Brussels sees an opportunity to work with the United States in addressing the problem that is very real for Europe, and not because a Biden administration or a Trump 1 administration has sort of pointed to the Europeans that they should be worried about China. Europeans are worried about China for China's sake.
Well, I think that's a great point about how, with the EU sort of being the most clear-eyed, I think in some ways looking at European interests while you have various member states pursuing their own national interests. I want to probe a little bit, though, to sort of play devil's advocate here. And this is where a lot of the China experts here I talk to in Washington are very skeptical that Beijing can sort of seize on the split that's emerging in transatlantic relations. But just hypothetically, let's say in talks between the EU and China, or between European capitals and China, that Europe goes with a very clear message, say, we're not going to get anywhere unless you start to throttle down your support for the Russian defense industry. China then opens up some of its market to European consumer goods. So it increases some consumption, changes its market a little bit, but just really for European manufacturers. So it makes some sort of carve out for Europeans, enticing Germany and others. And so there's some real economic benefits there from accessing a slightly more open European market. And then when you talk about the foreign direct investment into Europe from China, that I think there's a realization that perhaps European manufacturers, especially American manufacturers, have a lot to learn from some of the Chinese manufacturing, particularly in batteries and other clean tech sectors. And so if you can't beat them, join them. And try to do what China did with European companies, joint ventures. You try to capitalize on their technology and learn how their manufacturing processes work. So you have Chinese investment coming in to Europe, but in a way that kind of benefits Europe overall economically. And then just one more point there is that, well, China may not believe in a liberal international order, but it believes in a rules-based international order, at least somewhat, at least it says it does. So perhaps there's room to cooperate on things like international climate agreements and COP and other things like that, so that you sort of see the framework for perhaps something that is somewhat enticing, especially at a moment when Washington is throwing tariffs at everybody. What do you think about that? And just playing devil's advocate here. So please poke as many holes and be as brutal as possible in response.
That's okay. I mean, I wrote a book in German called The End of the China Illusion, that was like basically targeting all of those specific illusions that you were talking about and sort of going at them one by one. So let's kind of walk through this. The first assertion that you're making here, and that is very important here, is China has to move, right? This will depend on Beijing changing its position and Beijing making a different offer. That's the premise here. So what you are arguing is sort of that China is under pressure from US policies so much that it will have to change policies that before it wasn't willing to do. So that is your assumption that is underlying this, which I think is an important starting point, because so far we don't see China making kind of changing policies, being more friendly. I think the first move that you have to sort of keep in mind is then when the US administration announced tariffs on Canada, Beijing started that moment to tariffs on canola products as retaliation for the EV tariffs. So sort of in the moment that it hurts, just inflict further pain has been the strategy so far. Also important to note that CRM export restrictions on critical raw materials at the moment do not only apply to the US, but also apply to Germany, Japan, etc., and others. So I think we have to be very clear what we're actually seeing here empirically from the Chinese side. So far, they have not made an offer to Europe that has been attractive and that has been in any way different. Now, that can change with growing pressure. And I think what the Europeans have been open so far is to say the offers that we have made in the past are on the table. So on EV tariffs, for example, we put tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. We have talked about potential for voluntary constraint, for minimum prices. There were other options on the table, and the Chinese side has always said flat out, nope, we don't want to do this. Now, if there's a willingness now from the Chinese side to have these conversations, again, I think the Europeans are the last to not actually have that chat. But for a substantial change, a lot has to change on the Chinese side. And again, market openings in the Chinese market at a time when Chinese companies are under pressure, where exports are difficult anyway, where it's difficult to generate the kind of growth for domestic companies in the Chinese market already. This is not the time in which it is particularly easy for the Chinese leadership to give more market shares to international companies. Quite the contrary, actually. This is not the time in which it is particularly easy to make concessions for the Chinese side because they are under pressure. The China-Russia relationship, another very important one, your premise would be this is sort of an optional relationship, right? For the Chinese side, they could or could not support Russia. They can just dial that down and everything would be a lot easier for them. But that has not been the strategic decision in the past few years. In the strategic decision of the past few years has been that Beijing has doubled down on that relationship. It could have already loosened that relationship and actually scored brownie points with the Europeans very early on. It could have had a lot of opportunities economically if it had wanted to change its economic policy and its strategic outlook to Russia. But it didn't want to so far because that is actually the strategic objective of the Chinese leadership. And I don't see how the current situation changes something about that so massively because one has gotten ready for what the US is doing now for the last 8 years. Basically, on day one of Trump 1, the Chinese leadership has gotten ready for day one of Trump 2. And then it has used the last 8 years to sort of insulate itself and get ready for this kind of policy that it is now experiencing. So I don't see that there's this massive kind of crisis moment in Beijing, this massive panic moment that will force them to throw everything else and all their other strategic objectives overboard instead of sort of waiting this out and winning the staring contest against the Trump administration, which seems to me a lot more likely. Maybe one word on sort of FDI and climate as well. Foreign direct investment from China is a two-edged sword. It's not clear where the economic benefit lies. The Chinese leadership has been very clear that it is not interested in massive technology transfers, that it is not actually interested in the version of joint venture structure that Europeans have done in the Chinese market, but instead that it is interested in opening final assembly plans to undercut tariff barriers, to be brutally honest. And so this is something that the Europeans have to decide for themselves in the end, whether that is worth it. If we want to have a conversation about, for example, Chinese battery plans, etc., then these negotiations in Europe can only happen from a position of strength. That means collectively exerting leverage. Tech transfer will not take place if the Chinese leadership negotiates with the local government in northern Italy or with, the city of Barcelona. Leverage is not created by Spain negotiating with China. This leverage is created by the European Union putting the entire pressure of the European single market onto the one side of the scale and Chinese investments on the other, and then negotiating the conditions of what that relationship could look like. The problem with this is that, in comparison to all the trade questions that we're having with China, the foreign direct investment lies squarely within the capacity of the member states. So this is where an imbalance is created, and this is where I would see the soft underbelly of the current Europe-China relationship is the foreign direct investment, the greenfield investment into European production, particularly on clean tech. And that brings me to the last point, the climate point. For the last 8 years, we have had a conversation about how China is our partner for climate change, because that was the only thing that people could come up with in the holy trinity of kind of competitor, rival, and partner that could fit into the partner box. And one couldn't really figure out anything else that would fit into the partner box. Turns out China isn't really our partner for climate change, because in China, the largest coal pipeline, we're seeing emissions going not necessarily in the direction that we wanted to go. We're not currently seeing the kind of ambitious updates to climate policy that we would like to see. And we see a China that is dominating the clean tech supply chain to a degree that is potentially threatening the buy-in of other partners into the clean transition because there's nothing to gain for them economically anymore. And so I think for us to uphold that narrative that for an ambitious NDC update, a national determined contribution update of China at the COP30, we're willing to throw all sorts of other strategic priorities overboard. I don't think Europe is that naive anymore.
Let me quickly turn to the new German government that is coming to office. I think the white smoke has come from Berlin in the party negotiations. We're recording on April 15th, tax day here in Washington. Friedrich Merz will be the new German chancellor. He's going to form a government with the SPD. SPD has lots of the ministries, including the finance ministry. How do you see China policy evolving in a new German government? You mentioned earlier in this conversation how central Germany is to European China policy. In Germany, in the past, major German companies have in some ways become quasi Chinese companies as well through the process of integrating and selling into the Chinese market. Where do you see a Meretz government going? Is it going to be more hawkish than what we've seen, or is it going to be the status quo?
So yeah, this is the missing puzzle piece in the sort of Europe-China, where are things headed conversation, because with the early elections, with the snap elections, with the change of the government, Germany has hit the pause button on a lot of important policy issues for the time being, for a certain moment now, until we have a new government, until all those new pieces are in place, until all the new players have found their new role. And so everyone is sitting here and sort of waiting for what the next positions are going to be. And we can only operate on what we have heard so far, what we have seen so far, what we can deduce, because quite frankly, a number of these players have been so busy with dealing with the immediate government crisis here in Germany, with dealing with the immediate kind of policy issues with regard to Ukraine, with regard to the United States, that quite frankly, they haven't had time to think about a coherent approach to China yet. So that is, I think, an important part of it that often gets kind of forgotten about. While in the top 5 of the priority list, top 1 and top 2 are taking up so much space that is barely enough room for top 3. And so you barely get to top 5 under the current circumstances. What we can say is that Merz has presented himself with a tougher edge on China, particularly on the foreign policy dimension, not necessarily on the economic policy dimension. And these interests could clash with each other. Merz has also not been subjected to intense lobbying pressure while being the chancellor, which will also change the dynamics. We have seen letters here in Germany kind of being leaked to the press of Mittelstand companies and large enterprises that are calling for a rethink on China, a re-engagement. So obviously this sort of the corporate pressure will be on for the short-term relief, that the idea, the dream, and the illusion of a better relationship with China could bring to, their shareholder profits, the potential for their company in the very short term. On the social democratic side, I would say there's a lot of people not involved anymore in central roles that have held quite strongly ideologically, I'd say, pro-engagement positions on China. And we see a newer gang moving in that has a more realistic take when it comes to China, but also not as set views as one might expect. So right now, it seems that the German China policy is kind of broadly stay course on what the last government has done, which is a sharpening of the position, a hardening of the position, with exceptions like the flip-flopping on the electric vehicle tariffs, with a slightly more difficult stance when it comes to sort of the economic policy side of things. The big question is going to be, is Berlin going to support Brussels, which is in the lead and driver's seat on China policy anyway when it comes to the economic policy, or is it going to distort policy processes in Brussels? At the moment, it doesn't look like the latter. It looks more like the former. But we will see how the sort of situation evolves in the next few weeks and months. I think it is a little bit too early to tell. And I find all those that are saying, oh, it's very clear Merz will take a more hawkish stance, or it is very clear the Merz government will be totally influenced by big industry and will therefore be softer on China. I find it a bit too simplistic at the moment. I do think that Merz has the instincts for a good China policy, but finds himself at the moment in the situation where he has to consider not only de-risking from China, but also de-risking from the US. And whether Germany is ready for a dual de-risking process when before it wasn't even ready for a one de-risking strategy is a big question. But there's the political momentum and potentially the money to kind of follow along that path and strengthen Europe's role in this.
It's an incredibly dynamic environment right now in Europe, especially when it comes to China policy, transatlantic relations. One thing I'm sort of also just looking out for is in the last week, we've seen the EU throw out free trade agreements or the prospect of negotiating free trade agreements with countries around the world, UAE, but also the CPTPP, India. One question would be whether building stronger relations with countries like Japan, Korea, India, then does that sort of sap some of the momentum behind notions of trying to build stronger relations with China, particularly if you're engaging with countries that are quite nervous about the rise of China. So a lot to watch out for. Thank you so much for joining us from Berlin and giving us the inside take on what's happening there and in Europe.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.